in the first half of Norway Chess. The game between world champion and world number one turned out to be a classic. Remember the finish with both kings wandering around the board and Carlsen finally delivering checkmate? Well, this return bout turned out to be a classic too. Let's see what happens. So Gukesh playing with white, and it's a Spanish, and Carlsen goes for the Berlin. D3 keeps the most tension. And C3 covers the D4 square and perhaps prepares D4. And both sides have experience with this position. Carlsen has really a lot of experience and has pretty good results with this. Bishop drops back to A4, H6, and rook E1, B5, bishop comes back. It's all pretty standard. Bishop drops back, preempting a possible D4. Knight D2. And Carlsen goes for knight E7. So very standard maneuver. The knight wants to come around to G6 where it's aggressively placed, potentially looking at the F4 square, also supporting E5, but also he makes room for the C pawn to advance. A4, standard move in the Spanish, looking to just chip away at that pawn on B5. If black takes, then white is very happy because gives white, for example, control over the C4 square, and that's potentially a problem later on, that weak pawn. So rook B8 is decent response, but it does mean that white can take some control over the A file if he wants. But D4 played, so Gukesh advances in the middle. Knight G6 holding the E5 pawn. And now there's a lot of tension in the middle. So knight F1, standard maneuver, wanting to come around to the king's side. C5, Carlsen puts even more pressure on that pawn on D4. So we have this very typical situation where it's not clear when the tension is going to be broken. Should white exchange? Should white hold the pawn there, or should white push on? Likewise for black. Should black release the tension? It's very tricky to judge these positions. I do think, however, that in this position white should exchange on B5. Not that the rook can penetrate, but we'll see why I think that's the best for white in a second. So anyway, knight G3 played, and Carlsen does decide to exchange a couple of pawns. Now, he doesn't want to take again because that would bring the knight to a good position, potentially into F5. Instead, Carlsen takes on A4 and then plays bishop B7. So we've got this typical situation. Who's going to release the tension? But you can see there's a lot of pressure now starting to build on white's center and here. And I think Gukesh's next move, D5, is a very understandable move. He wants to block out that bishop. That means the E4 pawn is more secure. If instead he'd taken on E5, then, well, you can see these bishops look wonderful. So that's no good. He could have played rook A3. Now that rook needs to come into the game. It's not going to come into the game through the middle very easily. But rook A3 seems decent. Although, having said that, I think Carlsen could get a good position, or let's say reasonable counterplay, by playing D5 and then knight E4. There's a lot of pressure here. So, yeah, basically, I think Carlsen is doing okay in this position. When I say okay, you know, I think he's equalised basically, and there is pressure on white centre. So I think D5 is a very understandable move, taking the pressure off E4. But Carlsen gets pretty decent play now, so there's no pressure on E5. Black doesn't need to worry about d takes e5. a5 is a nice move, just potentially creating a square for the bishop. Bishop e3, that is a strong piece, so Gukesh wants to exchange it off. Bishop came to c8 in the end. Well, this is also a very nice diagonal because there is potential pressure on that pawn on h3. b3 played, yeah, because there was a threat after the exchange to take on b2, an exchange, and knight f4. You see, now that the pressure is off e5, then this knight is free to leap forward, and that's beautifully placed. In combination with that bishop, you can see there is potential to do some damage here. Bishop c6 and rook b4. Now you can see that Carlsen is able to operate very well on the b file. That rook puts pressure here, but also the pawn on e4. And that's why I'm going to take you way back now. In this position, I think it was better to exchange on b5 because Black simply wouldn't be able to get any play on the b file at all. I know it's a very different position there, but I do think that would have been the most sensible. So okay, let's leap back to where we were. So the rook on b4, putting pressure here, queen c2, and g6, so that covers the f5 square. It's tempting to sacrifice straight away, actually. And queen c8, looking to take here and get in on g2, but then knight f5 blocks the queen out. That's a problem. So that's one of the reasons why g6 was played. Also gives the king a nice solid square on g7, but yeah, it's about stopping that knight getting into f5. So now white has to be very careful. So Gukesh, after 16 minutes, played king h1. That means the knight can drop back to defend the pawn. So for example, if bishop takes, pawn takes, queen c8, knight g1, and that defends. So bishop a6, the bishop flips to the side of the board, but looks like it would like to come in on d3. That's very nasty because the e4 pawn is now under fire. If that one drops, then d5 is weak. But also, once it drops, then Black is getting closer to the king. That's why knight d2 was played. So we've got 1, 2, 3 pieces defending that e-pawn, but then h5 from Carlsen. Very typical idea. Just looking to push again, drive the knight away, and take on e4. And Carlsen, it's absolutely clear, he's taking control. So Gukesh took the pawn on a5. And Carlsen pushed with h4. So, yeah, as I said before, he's looking to get in on that pawn on e4. And positionally, he would be a lot better. So rook a4 attacks the rook. So this is tricky stuff. If rook takes and pawn takes, you can see that the knight is attacked, and if it moves, then rook takes bishop. So Carlsen just supports that rook here. Rook drops back. And again, you know, there are tactics here, basically. But Carlsen isn't in a hurry. It's very interesting. He just pushes the king forward. Rook a7, and now rook d4. So that supports the bishop. So that means that there is potentially pawn takes knight is a threat because the rook supports the bishop, and then the knight can move away. So if knight f1, then bishop takes, knight takes pawn. You can see that Black's pieces, well, I mean, it's absolutely clear. Every picture tells a story. Black's pieces absolutely dominate the center. And in combination with this pawn, I think white's king is in some trouble. I mean, just contrast black's absolutely solid pawns protecting the king, and white's king is getting squeezed here. This is very nasty indeed. So knight f3 played, so it's getting very tactical, very tricky. Carlsen took. Now if knight takes rook, pawn takes pawn, and the pawn is going through, and that wins material. So f takes g3, knight takes h3. Yeah, remember this knight still attacks the rook, so a bit of urgency is required. And if some nice tactics here actually. So pawn takes knight was played. If knight takes rook, pawn takes, and if rook takes bishop, knight f2 check. Forks king and rook and wins material. Okay, it's very tricky. So pawn takes knight played and bishop takes e4. And knight takes rook is threatened. Well, now that the king has stepped up on rook d1. Okay, we need to kind of take stock after that flurry of tactics and exchanges. So material at the moment is still level. But white is in trouble. Again, comes back to the king safety. So you can see there's no defense along the second rank. These pieces look really dangerous. Obviously, if the knight moves, then this rook h1 mate, or if it moves in the wrong way. That pawn is isolated and loose. That pawn is isolated and loose. So Carlsen is in total control now. g4 played, bishop takes pawn, and now he's a pawn up. So he's got this beautiful clump of centre pawns. Can he get them down the board? Can he start an attack against white's king? I mean, that's the most likely thing, really. Exchange of pieces, exchange of bishops, and then knight f4, that knight. Reaching a beautiful square supported by this pawn. Rook c2. So Carlsen has got so far. What next, basically? Has to be a little bit careful because this rook on a7 could provide some counterplay. So, for example, rook takes b3, knight g5, gets through to f7. And what Carlsen did now was incredibly brave, especially considering that he didn't have a huge amount of time. Neither player had much time. I mean, maybe the most secure move here is knight e6, which prevents the knight coming into g5, and that's pretty secure. But it's such a sharp position with two rooks and a knight, and you need time to control this kind of position. Carlsen played king f6. I mean, it's a really brave move. Basically, he's bringing his king over towards these pawns. He's prevented knight g5 for the moment. Wants to support the pawns with the king and potentially moving the king down the board as well. And this is what happened. h4, king e6, knight g5 check, king d5. The king gets checked down the board. I mean, this is incredible. We're at move 42 now, so the players do get a 10-second increment. That's not much. And neither Gukesh or Carlsen had a huge amount of time on the clock. I mean, from memory, I was watching this and maybe about 2 or 3 minutes each at this point. Rook a4 check. And this is incredible, this king march. The king could contribute to an attack on white's king. But how safe is it? Rook f2. And actually, with little time on the clock here, Carlsen made a mistake. Both players down to their final seconds. f5. Elise takes control of the e4 square. And not that it's, absolutely clear. I mean, there would still be more checks. It's very scary. Another check here, rook f2. I mean, it looks potentially nasty, or maybe a draw, but knight d3 covers that key square. Should be good for black. But f6 played. A check. King e2. And, well, let me show you this one line. It's interesting compared to the line we just looked at. Here, Gukesh played rook a2 check, and that's a mistake, actually. Have a look at this. Rook e4. Now the king goes, the rook goes back to check here. If pawn takes knight, then rook a2 check. King has step back, rook f2. Now, rook a1 mate threatened. Therefore, rook takes b3. And white draws this with rook a1. The rook has to interpose. Rook a2, threatening a mate here. It's a really comical situation. Let's say this rook moves up, so that after the check the king escapes. But then rook f1, the position repeats, rook f2, and it's going to end in a draw. I mean, that's just a ludicrous finish. So Gukesh could have done that. He could have played rook e4. I mean, there are alternatives along the way for black, but that's actually a plausible line. Instead, Gukesh played rook a2. Now, this still might be a draw, but it's trickier. Rook d2, rook interposes, an exchange, knight e4 check, king e2, hitting the rook. If check, then the king comes up, attacks the knight, so therefore king g3. d5, got to get those pawns rolling, and both pawns are attacked. Knight takes f6, so now pawns are level, but there's potential for those pawns. I mean, this is such a sharp position. If d4, then knight d7 attacks rook and pawn, and this apparently is a draw, although getting this right for white would still be very difficult because that pawn looks really dangerous, but the computer tells me it's a draw. But Carlsen went for rook f8. I mean, that's such a tricky move. Attacking the knight. Now, if knight d7, this didn't happen, then there's a discovered check. Knight h5, and rook takes f3. Black wins. That's check. And if g5, then knight d3. See, this is a nasty pin. And d4, and those pawns are looking good now. There could be a check with the knight, and the d pawn goes through. Black is winning there. Gukesh, with seconds on the clock, found rook f2 check. Best move. King e1. And then he played knight d7. Now there's a difference here. Because if, let's say, knight h5 check, unmasking the rook, pawn takes knight, rook takes rook, knight e5 threatens a massive fork on d3, and after this, in fact, white is winning. So, for example, this g7, and white wins the race. It's incredible. The best move here is rook e8. And that should end in a draw. For example, like this, and d4 and knight c5. And white has just enough counterplay there. Okay, so what did Carlsen do instead? Well, again, seconds on the clock, and he played knight e2 check. He must have thought he was winning. So it's check, If the king moves, then rook takes rook. So therefore, rook takes knight, check. Knight takes, and d4. Presumably Carlsen thought this pawn was going through, but no. Can you spot the idea? I won't do a think and drink at this moment. I'll do one in a second. Knight e6. And the point is this. After d3, knight c5. The knight gets back in time, because if d2, knight e4, if black makes a queen, then knight check. But white is now winning this position. I think the safest way to do it is to play king f3 and king e4 and then queen one of these pawns. Just a fantastic spot by Gukesh, who was down to his final seconds, but it wasn't over. Carlsen found a last trick. King e3. Right. Here is where I'd like you to have a think. I'm going to have a drink of my lovely cup of tea, Yorkshire tea. White to play. There's only one way for white to win this position. And Gukesh, with seconds on the clock, found it. Can you find it too? White to play and win. Cheers. In this case, knight takes d3 does not win. I hope you calculated this. Because the king is able to shepherd that pawn down the board. If king f2, well, e4 wouldn't be very good because the king comes to e1 and then, well, that one's going to go, one of them is going to go through. But here's the trick. Black plays, instead of e4, king d2, preparing to guide the pawn down the board. And if king f3, the king just nudges back to d3 and it's a draw. That pawn is going to go through. So for example, h5, exchange, e4 check, king comes back and king here. And the pawn gets through. And that one, I imagine, is going to end in a draw. Okay, so how does white win this position? Well, there is a way. And Gukesh found it. With seconds on the clock, he found knight a4. Wow. Just an exquisite move. If d2, then knight b2. See, that knight does a very good job of controlling the queening square and also protects this one, and then the h-pawn is going to roll. Carlsen played e4, h5, king d2, knight b2, another fantastic move. Because after e3, a check. So the king can't move away from this pawn, so king e2. Scary, looks like the pawn is going to run. But king f4, fantastic. So if d2, knight takes pawn, controls the queening square. And this pawn is going to run through. Now at this point, Magnus, in complete frustration, banged the table. The pieces went flying. And he resigned. He shook Gukesh's hand. And that was it. So the world champion has beaten the world #1 for the first time in a classical game. So that's a big day for Gukesh, and many congratulations to him. He was very calm afterwards. Although, in his first interview, he said, "I'm still shaking. I don't know what happened. I was trying to make moves that made it tricky for him." He said 99 times out of 100 he would lose that game. He said it's just a lucky day. Very modest. It was brilliant the way he found time and again ways to make the position difficult. And at the end, with seconds to find the only way to win, was just fantastic. Carlsen would be kicking himself because basically he outplayed Gukesh and built up a winning position. But the problem is, it was still incredibly complex. And although, this king maneuver was really daring and probably a good idea objectively, but actually with very little time, very difficult to control this position. But he'll be kicking himself. It was really entertaining. I'm sure you'll find clips of the finish online. Do check it out. It was really entertaining to watch, actually. But yeah, a great win for Gukesh. I'm delighted for him. So, well, after that, basically, that means that Gukesh has bounced right up in the standings. It's so close. There's only 3 points separating Wei Yi at the bottom and Carlsen and Caruana at the top. So going to the second half of Norway Chess, there really is all to play for. It's going to be really entertaining. Tomorrow, Carlsen plays Nakamura, so that's going to be a tough one. Let's see how the world number one bounces back from that. One more thing, my Chessable courses, Sicilian Kalashnikov and Anti-Sicilians for Black, are on sale for about another 24 hours. Basically, the end of a long weekend. That's when the sale finishes. So do take advantage of a ludicrously cheap price to buy them now. Thanks for watching.